morning, everyone. Sorry for the wait. We will start in a few seconds. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name and where you're joining us from as you enter. Thank you. We'll start in a few seconds as more people join. Welcome. I see there's many people joining from all over the world. Welcome. Wonderful. Okay, so I'll get us started because we are starting a little late. We apologize for that. But welcome to today's webinar. We are so happy to have you all join us today. Just a few quick logistics before we get started. So we are pleased to offer you Spanish and English interpretation today. Please find the interpretation button at the bottom right corner of your menu. So where there's the menu bar in the bottom, on the right side, you'll see that interpretation button. So you will have the option to choose between Spanish or English. Please click on the language that you are most comfortable with and that you prefer. If for some reason you are unable to hear anything when you're on one of the, when you're on the Spanish or English channel, just go on off and you'll be able to hear what's going on with the presentation. If you are comfortable with both languages, then you can just stay on off and you'll be able to hear everything. Since we have so many attendees joining us today from all over the world, your audio and video are disabled to ensure we have good connection. But we welcome you to introduce yourself, as I can see many of you are already doing in the chat box. And then as different speakers and panelists present, please feel free to send questions through the Q&A box, also in the menu on the bottom of your screen, which we will then do our best to address these questions in the last 15 minutes of the webinar during the Q&A session. Please note that the chat function where you're all introducing yourself is not for the Q&A. So we will not monitor questions sent in the chat. Therefore, please make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A box. Finally, we will record this presentation and have it available on the Global Women's Institute webpage for your playback later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce GWI Director, Dr. Mary Ellsberg.
Thank you, Devyani. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. We know that there's so many friends and colleagues from all over the world in this webinar, and particularly I've seen many of our colleagues and co-authors from the earlier studies in Nicaragua, from Sweden and Nicaragua, and members of the Nicaraguan Network of Women Against Violence. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat box. My colleagues, William Ugarte from Uppsala University and UNAM León, and Margarita Quintanilla from Intercambios, and I will start the webinar with a brief summary of the main findings of the two studies that were carried out in León, Nicaragua. And then we will have a panel discussion with our distinguished colleagues from the World Health Organization and from the women's movement in Nicaragua. Next slide.
Sorry, Mary, before we go to the next slide, could you quickly just let
para quienes, para la traducción, right? For the para quienes no entendieron,
for any of those who didn't understand, there is an icon at the bottom. It's like a little globe at the bottom of your Zoom page. And if you touch on where it says interpretation or click there, you have the options of English, Spanish, or off. Off is if you speak both languages. You can choose Spanish, for example, and everything will be that is said in English will be interpreted into Spanish. If you choose the English channel, then when Spanish is what the presentation is being made in, then you'll hear interpretation into English.
So if you want English interpretation later on when we're speaking in Spanish, please move to the English button and you'll get interpretation into English.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gracias.
You can continue. Thank you.
I'd like to start by acknowledging my colleagues and co-authors from the 1995 study, Rodolfo Peña y Andrés Herrera from UNAM León, Nicaragua, And I'd also like to acknowledge Jerker Lidistran and Anna Wingqvist, who were my doctoral advisors at Umeå University in Sweden. And I think both of them are on the webinar today. And also I'd like to thank the interviewers from that study who are pictured here. Next. And then I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues from both Intercambios, Margarita Quintanilla and Yamilet Molina, and my colleagues from UNAM León, who participated in the 2016 study, most of whom are in this photo as well. And sadly, I don't have time to mention all your names, but we're very grateful to all of you and hope that you're on this webinar as well. Next. Both studies were carried out in the municipality of León, which is Nicaragua's second largest city and home to the country's first medical school. Next. In 1995, we carried out a study to determine the prevalence of intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence, in León. We interviewed nearly 500 women about their experiences of physical, sexual, or emotional violence at the hands of their intimate partners. Next. The results of the survey were truly shocking. It turned out that 52%, or 1 out of every 2 women we interviewed, had been beaten or raped by a partner in their lives. And 1 out of 4 women had been beaten in the last year before the interview took place. This was vastly more cases than anyone expected. Only 3,000 cases of domestic violence had been reported to the police the year before, whereas according to our calculations, nearly 250,000 women had actually experienced domestic violence. In subsequent studies, we found that women who had been physically or sexually abused were much more likely to suffer depression, to have attempted suicide, to have complications during pregnancy, and their babies were more likely to be underweight and to die before their first birthdays. Next. We presented these findings in international scientific journals and conferences, but also to policymakers, health workers, and community activists all over Nicaragua. It caused a huge wave of indignation throughout the country. In addition to the numbers, we told the story of a young woman named Ana Cristina, whose story became the title of our study. She'd been married at age 15 to a man who brutalized her and her 2 daughters for years. When he would come home drunk and abusive, she was forced to escape over the wall with her girls and sleep in the neighbor's patio. Next. He would tell her that she was worthless and deserved the beatings, and she believed him. Her mother told her that everyone went through this and she should keep her family together no matter what. The few times she went to the police, they sent her home and told her to be a better wife. Whenever she tried to leave, her husband would always manage to win her back afterwards with apologies and gifts. But one day her grandmother sat her down and urged her to leave, saying, "Child, what are you going to do with candies in hell?" Her grandmother's support gave Ana Cristina the courage to finally leave her husband and free herself of the violence. After we presented our research, "I don't want any more candies in hell" became a rallying cry for women to stand up to violence. Next. We used the story of Ana Cristina and the findings of the study to advocate for a new law to protect women from domestic violence. I'll let Violeta tell you more about that later. And as you can see from these pictures, this is Violeta, me, and a lawyer colleague named Beth Stevens at the National Assembly lobbying for the new law, and many other colleagues from the national network behind us. And you can also see Margarita and Violeta down in the left-hand corner. You can see we were all children in those days. When we were asking women about their experiences, one woman asked us why she should tell us her story. It was so painful to recall, and she couldn't see what good it would do. One of our interviewers, who had been through violence herself, said, "It probably won't help you or me, but maybe by telling your story, our daughters and granddaughters will have a better life and won't have to suffer the way we have." Remembering this story, we decided to return to León 20 years later to talk to women and to see what had changed for them since the first study. And most importantly, what lessons had been learned along the way. I'll now turn to William to tell you more about the 2016 study.
Hello, thank you, Mary. And before I begin my presentation, I would like to say it was a distinct honor to be part of this amazing project and work with extraordinary people. And continuing with what you were saying, in 2016 follow-up study, we include 1,400 women aged 15 to 64 to have the perspective of all the women who might have participated in the former study. Although we use a random sample of women, a few of the participants mentioned that they have answered similar questions about 20 years earlier. We used the latest version of the questionnaire for the WHO multi-country study on women's health and domestic violence against women. This study drew on the experience of earlier studies, so the questions are very similar. Next. So it is important to mention that we also follow the WHO ethical and safety guidelines for researching violence against women and took special measures to ensure privacy and confidentiality and to protect the safety of respondents and interviewers. This includes carrying out the interviews in places where others could not hear what the women were talking about, and providing information and referrals for women living with violence to get help. Next, please. We also carry out qualitative interviews with community men and women, service providers, government officials, and women's rights activists. This is a picture of a workshop with help with women from the network of Women Against Violence to talk about their work over the last 20 years to end violence against women. Next, please. Unfortunately, we don't have time to present all the rich findings from the study, but we will show you some of the main findings. Among them, next please, we would like to really emphasize that overall, we found a great reductions in the prevalence of physical and emotional violence. Lifetime physical violence went down from 52% to 28%, which translates into 63% reduction when we control for other demographic variables like age and education. Physical violence during the last 12 months went down even more, from 27% to 8%, for a 70% reduction, and similar decrease were found for emotional violence. Surprisingly, sexual violence by a partner only decreased from 22% to 50%, which was not statistically significant. Next, please. Our findings are consistent with the tendencies shown in 3 demographic health surveys that took place between 1998 and 2011. However, our figures in both cases are higher than those results, which often happens because of differences in methodology, training of interviewers, and the use of safety measures. And next, please. For the first time, we measure also a variety of forms of sexual violence by non-partners and found that nearly half of all women had experienced some form of sexual violence. The most common forms of violence occur in public places, such as public transportation, followed by sexual electronic texts. About 1 of every 10 women experience rape or attempted rape by someone other than an intimate partner. Now I will pass to my colleague Margarita to talk about why we think those changes occurs.
Thank you, William and Mary. It is for sure a pleasure to be here sharing the results of CONFITES 20 years later. And it was a pleasure indeed to be a part of this amazing team. So why was there a decrease of violence in Nicaragua? Seeing those results, we look closely at the data to try to understand the reason for the great reduction in IPV. First of all, we saw that more women were seeking help for violence than before, whereas in 1995, only 1 out of 5 women who experienced violence looked for help outside the home. In 2016, it was 1 out of 3 women. The biggest increase was among women who reported violence to the police or comisarias, followed by the hospitals or health centers and crisis centers run by the women's organization. We also found, next please. We also found that social communication programs and campaigns made a difference in how both men and women view the acceptability of violence. 70% of the women we survived and had watched one of the social soaps, like Sexto Sentido, produced by Puntos de Encuentro. And a third of all women remembered one of the slogans from a campaign of the National Network of Women Against Violence, like this one that say, "There is no excuse for violence." Next, please. We can see the result of these campaigns in the changes over time in women's attitude about when it is acceptable for a man to beat his wife. In 1998, when the questions were asked in a DHA survey, almost 40% of women thought it was acceptable for at least one reason, with the most common reason being if she neglected her children or housework, or left the house without permission, or if she refused to have sex with him. In 2016, these numbers were much lower, and only 8% of women felt that there was any acceptable reason for violence. We also found that women were more aware of their rights. 90% of them knew there was a law against violence against women and girls, and 80% felt that the new law, 779-779, helped women who suffered violence. Next, please. From this data and from the qualitative interview we carry out, we conclude that physical violence against women and girls is less acceptable to both Nicaraguan men and women, particularly young women. We believe this great achievement is largely due to the work of the Nicaraguan feminist movement, and in particular, the Network of Women Against Violence. As Ana Cristina said recently, before, violence was a taboo, something you shouldn't talk about. Now, there is more rejection of violence. I think that women are more deciding, that they won't just stay in a relationship because it's their husband and they are going to stick with him till the end. That doesn't happen anymore. Next, please. However, we will see from the panel that follows, we still have a long way to go to ensure that women are able to live free of violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William and Margarita, for helping us with this presentation. We're now going to move to a panel with my colleagues, and I'll introduce them right now. We have Claudia Garcia Moreno, who is the head of the Unit for Addressing Vulnerable Populations in the Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research of the World Health Organization. And I'll mention here also that Claudia was responsible for developing the multi-country study on violence and women's health, domestic violence against women, and has been involved in leading research on violence against women for many years. We also have Violeta Delgado, who is a feminist activist from Nicaragua. And we're excited to have Violeta here because she's a historical voice of what happened in the 90s, particularly Violeta was the executive secretary of the National Network of Women Against Violence during this period. And finally, we have Marice Mejia, who is the national liaison of the National Network of Women Against Violence in Nicaragua. And we worked very closely with the National Network, both in the 1995 study, but also now in 2016. And we're very honored and pleased to have them today with us in the panel to talk about things that have changed over the last 5 years since we did the study. And as many of you know, there have been many, many changes, most of them very negative for women and girls. So I'll start with Claudia to give us a little bit of the overview, the global vision of what this study in Nicaragua means for the field and for violence prevention, and any comments or lessons you can talk to us about that. You're muted.
The usual story. Thank you, Mary, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to just a few words in Spanish to start, although I'm going to speak in English. Quería comenzar saludando a las...
I'd like to start by saying hello to all of the colleagues in Nicaragua. It's wonderful to be able to share this moment with you all to recognize and celebrate all of the work done in this study about the violence against women in Nicaragua and what it represents on a global scale. I have many connections with Nicaragua. I won't go into details, but afterwards in the panel we can chat about that now.
Just reflecting a little bit on the first Candies in Health study from Leon, and how significant it was for the work in the area of measurement and studying violence against women at the global level. And just to remind ourselves that at the time that the study was done, there were very few epidemiological studies and reliable data on violence against women from low and middle income countries. And this study really highlighted both how high the prevalence was, but also how acceptable this form of violence, particularly intimate partner violence, was. And of course, we had known for a long time from women's organizations and human rights and women's health activists and from women themselves, that this issue was really affecting their lives very profoundly. But there was little recognition on the part of governments or even global institutions like my own, the World Health Organization, of how prevalent and how important this problem really was. We were helped by the Beijing Conference for Women in 1995 in its platform for action, recognized that the lack of data was something that on violence against women was something that needed to be addressed urgently, and that we needed this data both to understand the problem and also to help us to monitor the implementation and the progress being made or not once programs and policies were being implemented. And in early 2006, WHO organized its first ever meeting dedicated exclusively to violence against women. And we brought together some women's NGOs and others to reflect on, what could WHO best contribute to helping move forward the agenda to prevent and respond to violence against women. And one of the recommendations from that meeting was that there was a need for an epidemiological study that would collect data in a scientifically sound way that would be credible to governments and that would help to ground the advocacy. And this led to the multi-country study, which Mary referred to and which I assume many of you will be familiar with. And the study sought to measure the magnitude and the nature of the problem, what were some of the factors driving this prevalence, what was the impact on violence, and particularly it focused on intimate partner violence, although it also captured other forms of violence and sexual violence. What was the impact of this violence on the health and the lives of women? And we were lucky that as we were developing the study and putting together the team for this, it coincided with Mary's return from Nicaragua to the US, and she joined the core team that developed and implemented the study. And in this way, we really were able to benefit very directly from the experience of the first Lyon study. And I think some of the important contributions, I will highlight three. One was around the strengthening of the measure, and what were the kinds of acts that we needed to include in the measurement of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Then it led to bringing together different researchers to reflect on the ethical and safety issues that led to the WHO recommendations on ethics and safety. And very importantly, and I really want to highlight this, was the engagement of women's organization and the women's movement in the research, and we were really able to bring to the multi-country study this model of bringing women's organizations with policymakers and with researchers to ensure that the data would really be used and really make a difference, not to think of research as, research that produces nice papers and sits on a shelf, but really learning from Confites and from all the advocacy work that was done around that, including the very important work done around, using the data to change the law, which was really very groundbreaking. And so that was really an important contribution from the first study. And I think this second study, this 2016 study, going back to the same setting with a very similar methodology 20 years later, I think the data is really powerful. I mean, what we've just the little snippets we've just, seen, it really shows that with concerted efforts and investments and a strong women's movement, it is possible to make changes in the prevalence at a population level. And this is a very hopeful message. It really demonstrates to policymakers that it is possible to change the prevalence of at least some forms of domestic violence. And of course, we need to look much more closely at what has changed, what has not, and build on these learnings. And I think this is what we're gonna do in the next hour and in the panel discussion. And I'm really looking forward to those discussions. But I think this message of hope and of the possibilities for prevention is a very important one at this moment. So I'll stop there and can come back to these issues during the conversation we're having.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And thank you so much for joining us here. It's really, I think many of us are feeling a lot of nostalgia for these different times in which we were just getting started in the study of violence against women, and there were many fewer of us at the time. Warning those of you who speak English that I'm going to move into Spanish now, so you can go to the interpretation button and ask and point out the English button, and then you will be getting interpretation into English because our next two panelists will be speaking in Spanish. Ahora voy a comenzar a hablar en español.
Now I'm going to start speaking in Spanish for the next two panelists, starting with you, Violeta. First off, welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you again here. You were the executive secretary of the Network of Women Against Violence at the time that we did Candies, and since the beginning, and since the network was started in 1992, could you tell us a little bit about, first off, what did Candies in Hell mean for the strategy of feminist women in order to improve the laws? And how do you think the study interacted with the activism? And what do you think about the great change that we saw between 95 and 2016? What do you think could explain why there was such a decrease in physical violence? Thank you, Mary. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Hello to everyone who is on the panel and everyone who is connected and listening to us. Well, just like Mary has mentioned and Claudia mentioned, the data that came from Candies offered a perspective on the severity of the problem and also supported the narratives of the women. Perhaps we were hearing about what was happening in the houses in our communities. For the first time, there was information that the decision makers could use to understand clearly the situation that the women were living. Last night, I was thinking, if we hadn't called the study Candies in Hell, it probably would have been called doll soup. And doll soup is a term that, on a popular level, is used to talk about violence against women. If a woman was living in a violent situation, you would say she had doll soup last night. And it would never be referred to with the name that we use today, which is violence against women in the public or the private areas. So it wasn't just a way to recognize that the decision makers could make changes to affect this, but it was also a way for Nicaraguan society could transform itself in the way that it views this problem. Candies was in a moment that we called like the spring of the rights of women on a global level, and also in a way that coincided with a moment of democracy in Nicaragua. We had the conference in Beijing, and we also had the process of the Belén do Pará, which is where everyone in the world together decided that they would define better policies to and implementation of sanctions with regards to violence against women. And for the first time, people could identify that an international policy could have a direct effect on your life. So it wasn't just having a meeting of bureaucrats that were very well dressed, speaking very fancy, but the Belén do Pará Convention really supported the creation of the law that was then known as Ley 230. And we consider that as the mother of the Law 779. And that facilitated three elements that really affected all women in Nicaragua. First off, there were judicial measures where a judge could say, "Sir, you cannot come to this house. You are prohibited." That was the first time that that happened in the history of this country. And for the first time, there was a recognition of the psychological violence and psychological violence as a crime. And this was created with the support of this investigation. And for the first time, the Nicaraguan state committed to protecting the emotional well-being of these women. And as we were talking a few days ago when we were talking about this forum, we were able to eliminate a crime where the law in Nicaragua would punish women but not men. Yes, I should have put the name. Excuse me. I forget that. It slips my mind. But the adultery lay in Nicaragua said that any woman, if you could show that she had a relationship outside of her marriage, even if it was just a rumor or that she had been seen chatting with somebody, that she could be arrested, and not for the men. If the men were able to keep a second home 500 meters close to his other home, basically it would be like a plan to better define this law, but they said, no, this is not a crime because the woman is the pillar of the family and they must be, their honor must be protected and protect the honor of the families. So we told them, just like how you saw us seated in that picture that was shown, if you're gonna leave it, well, let's have the circumstances be equal for women and men. So they decided to remove the crime so that it would not be a crime for women, that it would be the same rules for both women and men. And when in 1996, when we had the first results of Candies, that was no longer a crime. I think that in just a few minutes, it was really very important. And I think that the Women's Network, this is a very powerful movement, and it had the possibility of establishing an alliance, a very powerful alliance with the Academy, with women who were making decisions, and they were able to convene the Nicaraguan society and women, and probably the younger women who are listening might remember. They can maybe ask one of their mothers about the pins that said, I want to live without violence, and that they would put on their backpacks, on their purses, and it says that I am committed to this. And there were more than 50,000 women that in 1 week signed. I remember there was women who worked in banks that would say, I can't go anywhere to sign this, but I'm going to sign it and I'm going to send it to fax, because back then there was no PDFs, no internet. I'm going to send my letter via fax. And it was a beautiful collective effort of many people that was able to help us achieve what we did achieve. I think obviously this has an important effect. I've been thinking about this in the last few days. Nicaragua is a very young population. Many of the women that were interviewed
a la población existente en nuestras comunidades.
In our communities, when we did Candies, they were young girls, and they are the ones who were able to receive this new version of the laws, and they were able to obtain this new version, this new proposal, that violence against women is not acceptable, that the violence against women is not something that the women should be silent about. These percentages that were mentioned as far as what are the important variations as far as those who are not seeing the violence as anything that could be justified is very key in this sense. There's still many things to address that we're probably going to explore and share during these next few minutes that will be on the panel. But this theme of sexual violence, I don't know if it would be the time for me to mention this now, and the times that what we were talking about a few days ago, it's not that there haven't been changes in sexual violence, and also femicide. Femicide is intact, and there's a lot more to explore. Why have the women been able to reduce violence in the private sector, but not the killing, the assassination of women, or sexual violence? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thank you so much, Violeta. I saw people making comments like, this is making me cry, remembering everything that was done at that time. Talking about those signatures, the photograph that you put up of that open letter to the legislator in the assembly, well, that was signed by a woman from Mulucucu. And Mulucucu, for those who don't know, Nicaragua is quite far from Managua. And the fact that she was able to sign this letter and get it to Managua within 2 weeks so that the legislators would see it was very striking. Now, we would give the floor to Marise from the Network of Women Against Violence. We've talked about the difference you see in young women, and it's likely that a large part of the decline in violence is because of the experience of young women and young men has been different. So I have two questions for you, Marise. Beginning with, well, as a young woman who is now leading this movement, how do you think that the work of the women's movement 20 years ago that you're hearing about now, how would you say that that affected your own life? That's my first question, and then I have another one. Thank you very much, Mary, and the whole team, and everyone who is with us on this panel discussion. Yes, all of this work of the Network of Women Against Violence and the women's movement over all of these long years has certainly found resonance in myself, in my awareness, in my body, because I am a result of that study, beginning with the fact that my mother was also an activist going back a long time, and she inculcated in me that we women have to be free of all forms of violence in the private sphere and in the public sphere. All of these lessons have had an impact on me, and so now I am part of a community-based organization of young women, and I'm the national liaison of the Network of Women Against Violence. And all of that experience, all of this knowledge that I acquired, well, I am now sharing it with other girls and adolescent young women. So this whole struggle has not been in vain, because we have young women, there are some of us who are young women who are sharing this struggle and spreading it to many girls and adolescent young women in many communities who have scant access to resources and who are transforming their lives. So I am myself a result of that women of the women's struggle going back many years. Thank you, Marise. We'd now like to take a turn in this discussion. We wanted to establish two moments in this conversation. First, we wanted to celebrate everything that has been done with the historical perspective, recalling everything that was done at that time with the studies, with activism, and with the work of women at crisis centers and shelters, with so many women working across the country. And the results of that work are being measured, or have been measured, in a study that now dates back about almost 5 years, the study that was done in 2016. So why, one might ask, did it take us so long to present the data? Well, we had wanted to make a presentation and report on the basic data in Nicaragua, and this was planned to be done in May of 2018. Now, you all know why we were not able to do it. And then we turned more to making international presentations and including that data in the scientific journals and publish it outside Nicaragua as much as possible. This is the first time that we've had the opportunity to talk about these data and these results with Nicaraguans. That's why this event is so important for us. So as many have mentioned in the chat, a lot has changed in the last 5 years. And we'd like to ask first Marise, and then we'll open it up to other members of the panel. to address the question, what has changed for all of those accomplishments that we talked about of the police stations for women and children, crisis services for women, well, all of that, many things have changed. So Marise, we'd like if you could tell us, please, about what changes you've seen in the last 5 years and how are you addressing it? Well, I didn't really want to talk about this aspect because it's tough. It's tough knowing that we have seen some setbacks because of the situation in the country since, well, since before 2018. And in such a changing context as in Nicaragua after the drawing up of this study, over 20 years ago in Leon, many things have happened in 2017 with 51 femicides, which was an upward trend, and there is an upward trend in femicides compared to 2015 or 2016, which is when the study was carried out. So reforms of the general law on violence against women, Law 779, that's where mediation and family counselors were imposed, where the lives of women and girls have really been totally put at risk. And there's also been a complete dismantling of the comprehensive care approach to victims of violence. In 2017 was the complete shutdown of the women's police stations. There was absolutely nothing left of a specialized institution for women to be able to go to seek help. And it was in 2017, that was the last year when the women's movement took to the streets to protest, to demand greater belligerence of the state so as to address and prevent violence and femicides. In 2018, a socio-political and humanitarian crisis was set off that continues. There's been a systematic increase in violence, not only violence against women, there's now been unprecedented institutional violence. I'm talking about the current moment. And this has further deteriorated the rule of law in Nicaragua in 2019 with that continuum of the socio-political and humanitarian crisis. Women's and girls' rights continued to be violated with legal gaps, making the data or figures on violence and femicides invisible, manipulating cases, and so on. There's been a almost absolute loss of confidence in the state institutions, especially the police, when it comes to responding to complaints or dealing with women in keeping with Law 779, which is the special legal instrument for protecting women and girls. Now in 2020, in addition to the socio-political crisis, we're now facing a health crisis because of COVID-19, where women are at risk. That women are spending more time with their assailants, with the abusers, girls as well, and the home is the least safe place for many women who are facing violence. With the amendments to the Law 779, as of now, 2020, having family mediators or family counselors has become the normal process, as I mentioned before. Now there's a family approach to machista violence, the crimes associated with macho violence, and there is no approach focused on protecting the lives of women and girls. In addition to all of this situation of human rights violation have been pardons which have occurred since 2018. There are more than 23,000 convicts who include wife beaters and murderers, and this is encouragement to others to exercise violence against women and girls. Also, many organizations have had to shut down either because of the economic crisis or because of government pressure. In addition, there's been systematic persecution of women human rights defenders, leaving women and girls even less safe and less protected because perhaps the organization they used to turn to for help is no longer there. Women human rights defenders who before protected them and accompanied them might be in exile, or at any rate can no longer accompany them. It's also been said that there's been a reopening of the women's police stations, but this is just infrastructure for there's not been a decline in the levels of violence, and there's been no change in the trend in terms of femicides. There are many testimonies from women who say their complaint is not even received. I've been very much struck by the case of a woman in Bluefields who has lodged 20 complaints regarding violence with the police, and they have not paid any attention to her. She has not been heard. So it's like just a one example to illustrate the national situation. So to be winding up, we have government officials who are totally outdated, who are not properly trained, who are not sensitive to the situations faced by women and girls. And I think this is one of the greatest obstacles to fighting violence. At this time, there's greater awareness, greater knowledge of the rights of women and girls, and the violence that affects us so much because of all of this work of the women's movement nationally and in the different parts of the country as well. But if there's no system of protection and justice, some protective shield for those women who provide prevention and reparation for the damage caused by violence and the punishment, then we women will continue to be at risk of experiencing violence or femicide. I think I will leave it at that, and we can continue going more into it. Thank you very much, Marise. As you can see in the chat, many people from Nicaragua, activists, are saying things. Here we have a former judicial official who are also citing examples of everything that has been happening in recent years. I would like to give the floor for a moment to William Ugarte. He was co-author and researcher on this study. Now, I don't know if you were even born when we I think you were born when we did the earlier study, but you were much younger. And there's a very nice blog, which I would invite you all to take a look at, about your experiences engaged in research on violence and women. I'd like it if you could say something about what the research on violence means for the researchers. Thank you very much, Mary, and all of the panelists and everybody who is joined from worldwide, but especially from Nicaragua. Now I'm going to try to answer two questions that have to do with what is the role of men been in reducing violence or in the findings that have been presented. First, I would like to note that many civil society organizations impacted on different things that have been done. In the 1990s, in the post-war period, there were efforts to come up with strategies for new ways of thinking. What did it mean? What does it mean to be a man, and the roles, and the fact that in many households there no longer was, the father was no longer present. Many single women became heads of their families or heads of household. And so those programs had a great impact on my generation. As an adolescent in the 1990s and then a young man in the 2000s, I can note that those changes were very evident, and the information put out by the publication La Boletina, the soap opera called Sexto Sentido, Sixth Sense, and everything that would be everything that was done to change men's way of thinking was important. Now, as a physician and later as a researcher at the Center for Demography and Health at the National Autonomous University of León, and you mentioned at the outset Andres Herrera and Rodolfo Peña, where the researchers, well, to see the influence, the impact that your study had, and all of the research that continued, such as that by Valladares and Salazar, that took a look at the impact of violence on pregnant women the impact on their children, low birth weight, and also changes in models of masculinity and machismo. So there are any number of factors over that 20-year period that had a huge impact on men and on the conception that it is necessary to generate evidence to strengthen any advocacy action. Well, I think that is very important to highlight. It's often thought that this has only a political connotation, and all of the work and all of the information reported by the civil society organizations, the women's movement, any institution parallel to the government finds no support. Rather, it's considered as something that only has to do with activism, but we see that it is consistent with all of the research studies that have been carried out and published internationally, that there is scientific support for all of the findings that we've been seeing, and this has been shown by the different institutions. I'd also like to share with the whole team that we were privileged to be part of the great pride that it meant to be the voices for 1,400 women, and especially how the women interviewers said that having listened to each of these stories, and I would like to highlight that we would carry out visits at night, on weekends. We would visit the same person more than 3 times because we went to find the person. We would say, well, we'll come back and try to find her. We would do a sweep because we didn't want to miss the opportunity of a story being told. It's not just that we would go and she wasn't there and we would say, well, no show. No, we would visit at nighttime, on weekends. We would call by phone. And it was a commitment beyond what's written in research strategies. And I very much agree with what has been said. Thank you very much, William. And I think that the point you mentioned just now about the extra work the period of training with the interviewers, both for this study and as well as the 1995 study, was much more extensive than what one might find for a regular, say, demographic and health study. And so for the first study, we compared the data because the Endesa study found about 29% physical violence among women, and we found 52% in the same place, in Leon. And we believe that that change is due to all of the security rules and training that was provided and the great supervision that the women were given. And so you can see that even our data from 2016, it's half if you compare it to the study that we did in 1995, but it's still more than what the Endesa survey found 20 years ago. So we're dealing with the same trend, but with 2 different methodologies. And we are doing the comparison. We believe that our data is more real because of all of the measures that we've taken. We do have some time for Q&A, and then I'll ask for some further thoughts from the panelists. First, well, I think some have already been answered, but Patrick Welsh asks, can we deduce from the results that men in 2016 are less violent than they were in 1995? We think that the answer is yes. That is to say, when we say that there's less violence, fewer men are beating their wives, physical violence. So the change has not been only among women, the change has been among men and women. And in particular, we think that this is especially so of young men and young women. But since we are measuring among women who have been targeted by violence, that is why we put it in those terms. Now, there is a question on the communication campaigns and the work with men. I'm going to leave that for later because I think there's another one on the data themselves. I'm going to answer some questions on the data and then we'll move on to the other point. It was also asked if data were collected on men in these studies. Yes, but not quantitative data. We did a qualitative study in both studies where we garnered the opinions of men in the community, young persons, judges, psychologists, police, both men and women. So yes, when looking at social norms and everything having to do with the attitudes of government officials and men in the community, we did garner their opinions. But since it's the WHO methodology, in the survey, we only interviewed the women. And there is a question here from Janet Corrales that is seeking to understand the difference in types of measurement. And what we see, we say that the measurement of the other kinds of violence, not by partners, was done for the first time in 2016. And that is why we have data on sexual harassment, sex texts, and harassment on buses. This is new data that shows that sexual violence in public spaces is very high, but the data on partner sexual violence, it's the same questions. What we did in Nicaragua, we asked practically the same questions as were used in the WHO methodology for the reasons that were mentioned by Claudia. So these are questions also regarding physical and sexual violence. These are questions like, has your husband ever beaten you? Has he hit you? Has he slapped you? Has he pulled your hair? Has he used a knife or a pistol against you? And in this way, the experiences are measured. It's asked whether it's been in the last 12 months, and it's also asked what the frequency has been. In the case of sexual violence, we ask whether your husband had ever physically forced you to have sexual relations, if he had forced you as a matter of fear, had you had sexual relations not wanting to do so, but out of fear for what he might do, and did he ever make you carry out some degrading or humiliating act? And so we take the percentage of women who have experienced sexual violence based on those answers. And emotional violence would be measured by, well, if he had been emotionally abused you in public, threats, a number of things that are more psychological or verbal. So what we saw when we compared, we did a comparison of the women before and now in a database, there's a comparison and one controls for age, education, and other things that might come into play. We saw that the percentage of women who said that they had been beaten at some time in their life or sometime in the last year was much greater, much less, almost 70% less than the percentage of women who said this in 1995.
And in the case of sexual partner violence, it goes from 22 to 15, but that decrease is not significant. We need to do some more statistical tests to see if it's a true decrease or if the sample was a little different. So we have concluded that sexual violence, although it's a small decrease, we concluded that it's not significant, whereas in the case of emotional and physical, it is significant. And a last thing that I will ask, and then I will pass the word on to the rest. And the question is, as to what extent are the statistics from Leon similar to the rest of the country? I'll ask for some help with that one. But when we compare the data from Leon with the data from the rest of the country, they're very similar. So that makes us think that what's going on in Leon is very similar to what's happening in the rest of the country, with the exception perhaps of the Caribbean coast. because we know there are differences there. In the rural areas, paradoxically, in Nicaragua, there's less partner violence than in the cities. And that's different than in other countries where partner violence is more so in the rural areas than in the urban areas. We don't know why, but we do think that these data are relevant for the rest of the country. So now let's see who else wants to respond. There are questions. There's one that's more general. I'll leave that for the end. But there are some that have to do with the campaigns and the work with men. Let's see if anyone wants to take that one. And also this theme that to what extent are the data from Leon comparable to those to other countries? The one about the men, Margarita, Maricé, Violeta.
Manito, perdón.
Yes, sorry, I don't see the little hand. It's okay, just use this hand. I think that, as you said, the qualitative study shows a change in the mentality of men and women. I think there is a slide that we didn't share, but I think it's important to share. It wasn't just a change that had to do with the relationship between two, but how much is physical violence to women from men accepted? And we were trying to signal, for example, if a neighbor says to a woman who is experiencing violence, says, this is not allowed, this is not legal, and this makes you think of a change that's much more than just how am I relating in a partnership with my partner, but what do I accept from my neighbor? What do I accept as far as what's happening around me? And this has a much larger dimension because it has to do with social networks that also support women, which is something that we were not seeing more than 20 years ago. And the work of diverse organizations, including meeting points that put themselves to the task of creating this change. Social change is much broader as far as how we saw violence through sexto sentido or other experiences, like the generations that also were thinking about how much do we accept violence as men and as women. That was very important. I also wanted to mention an element that has to do with the youth and the change of the new generation. And Maricé had mentioned this. I think it's important to recognize that the changes in consciousness of rights and laws, if we are not getting answers from institutions and laws, there will be greater risk. It's a greater risk because I'm aware of what should not be happening, but I'm not finding a response that supports me. And I think that's very important for the current situation in Nicaragua. Someone else? Yes. Yes, I'd also like to share my opinion and talk about what Margarita has shared. I do think we have advanced as far as social sanctions, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. People don't see it as something normal that must be silenced and tolerated. But not only have the sanctions been advanced, but also the actions. The neighbor that says, I will take care of your kids, I'm going to support you, the community. It has advanced, but the great difficulty, the great challenges too, and what has been mentioned, Maricé mentioned it just a few minutes ago, the comment about impunity is really a big roadblock for violence against women. In 2010, we've been we were in a period that I think was evaluated by, I think it's within the framework of the investigation. There's 0.3% of the cases of crimes committed against women had been processed criminally. There was only 696 cases that were charged. So at this time, they're not doing their homework. And what Marisa mentioned a few minutes ago, and this has to do with the model of attention, closing the police stations. I understand that they are having a family opening in the same police stations, but it's not just the police stations. It's a model of attention, of coordinating interinstitutional services. And for many years, and it's been mentioned here, that the women and the defenders are subject to persecution. And I think I'm just mentioning this clearly. And finally, as far as the resolution, which is what I mentioned before, what level of resolution is reached? Another thing I'd like to recognize and mention of Centro Acción Ya and the collective March 8th have been emblematic in the protection of women in Nicaragua. And the possibilities of when they were functioning with the resources that they were having as a place to seek refuge. And also, I wanted to recognize the director of the Women's Network. She was the first woman to win a case of violence, of psychological violence in Nicaragua, and she said, we are going to do it. We are going to prove that psychological violence exists. And those tears and those scars that you have that are not visible, those are crimes, and those will be convicted. There have been great efforts, collective efforts, and great challenges that we have ahead of us. Thank you. I wanted to speak to the work being done with men. I know there have been many initiatives, gathering places, and lots of mixed groups focusing on gender issues with boys and girls, but I think it's something that there could be more of. I think there needs to be more organization of men to fight against violence, to talk about hegemonic violence. We can't continue, it can't just continue being the women about talking about how we are affected by the violence. The violence is a structural problem. It's a multidimensional that it affects all of us. And I think that it's time for men to organize themselves, to become more aware themselves of the rights of the others, of women. And so as an organization on community level, we work with children starting from a very young age, but I think there's still a great lack. Thank you, Marise. William, did you want to mention something? William, you are on mute. I also want to recognize the efforts of organizations like CEPRESI, which had worked and continues working, talking to men that have sex with men and talking about sexual diversity, because we also need to highlight that it has been demonstrated that there's a greater tolerance as far as the expression of different sexualities and reproductive rights in civil society, trying to also empower women and empower the groups that previously were the target of much discrimination in the community. And this has to do also with men demonstrating and defending their rights, talking about the different expressions of masculinity, which is also very important to highlight. We're gonna keep closing up. It's been a very rich discussion, and I have a few questions that I think would be excellent for concluding the session. First off, I'd like to say these questions and messages, we didn't know to leave if we should leave the chat open. There's so many people. There's almost 150 people here, but we thought it would be a great way to be able to communicate, considering that we hardly see each other anymore, and that the participants, a good way for the participants to share their points of view. I also wanted to say there's so many expressions of women's movement and NGOs that have done super important work. There's Monica Salaquet, who mentions Sepret. There's Acción Ya, all of the Women's Center. Amy Bank has also mentioned something, and we can send out the documents of Sexto Sentido and Edutenimiento. We would gladly do that. And if there's any other questions that have come up about things that we have mentioned, you can write us at Global Women's Institute and we can send those questions to the correct person. There's two questions, one from India and Africa, which I think are important, and I leave them as the last questions for the whole group to quickly respond. One is from Nandita Batla from New Delhi. In hard political and economic times that we're experiencing, what advice do you have for the women's movements that are being pushed in many directions to not lose the advances that have been made in violence against women? And another one of Lorisha from Raising Voices in Uganda. Thank you, Lori. All the work that has been done on multiple levels, political, legislative, in media and communication and community prevention, are inspiring. And I imagine that it also took a lot of coordination and solidarity amongst groups. What advice would you give to the feminist activists in other countries that could help us strengthen our efforts of prevention? Both questions are similar, and I think they're very important. So those who must leave, that's okay. I think we'll just take a little 5 or 10 minutes to give the last few answers and then to close as well. Who would like to go first? Some questions from other feminist activists in the world.
Marise, go ahead. Yes, thank you for that message in the chat. I extend greetings to you so far away. We're so happy that people are connecting from really all parts of the world. So what can I say about feminist activism and women's rights? Nicaragua is a show of this. We are working in a context marked by a lot of violence, a lot of institutional repression, and even so, that energy, that resistance, it doesn't see an end. So I would invite you to continue resisting, to continue being resilient, to continue to ensure you exercise self-care, because if we don't think about ourselves, no one else is going to think about us. I think that one must take care of one's body in order to be able to be a spokesperson and to be able to take action for others. So I think that that is key in this activist work that we do. And community action is so important. Bringing people together in the neighborhoods, in the communities, to continue talking about this issue that really affects each and every one of us. We are promoting a lot of community action. We are urging people to come together to help and protect girls and women because they have rights and they deserve to live free from violence. That's what I would say. Thank you, Marise. I now give the floor to Violeta. Thank you. Well, evidently, one of the major conclusions of this forum, and we've also been discussing it in recent days, is that the existence of a strong, belligerent, committed, and organized women's movement is what brought about the change that we're talking about right now. Without that, it's not likely that we would have been able to get this change because evidently, unfortunately, this is it's hard to bring about such changes if you're in a country without such organized movements, which are the ones who move and bring pressure to bear to make sure that states take on their commitments. And that is the other area that is still pending. We can do great work, but we need to have states, governments that are committed to women and women's rights, because otherwise we are going to be running up against a huge wall. And then all of these rights are interconnected. The right to live free from violence is very much tied up in the right to participate in politics. You can't be free from politics if you don't have the right to speak up, to bring influence to bear, if you don't have the right to participate in decision making, if you don't have strong institutions, if you don't have institutions of higher learning that are committed to women. And this is another factor that we've seen in Nicaragua in recent years. In effect, we still have so much that remains to be done, but we defend these changes. That, I think, is the big message that I want to share here. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Mary Ellsberg, for everything that you've done and continue doing. And I extend thanks to the Institute. Thank you, Violeta. Before giving the floor to Margarita, I did want to mention the message from Maria Esther Quintana, remembering Silvia Carrasco. She was a great fighter against violence and a promoter of Law 230, which ironically, she left us on a 25th of November, 16 years ago. And all of us who were honored to know Silvia remember her with great affection at this time. I'll now give the floor to Margarita Quintanilla. Thank you, Mary. I'm also very moved by all of this, and thank you for bringing about that approach, this integral approach that you've been working with. I think one of the biggest ideas of waking up and realizing that none of this would have been possible without the women's movement. And I think it's very important to note a spontaneous movement, an autonomous movement, a diverse movement that did not take as its starting point some kind of cooperation that would give impetus to these kinds of policies, but rather it was the desire of diverse women from different places, from the communities, from women who were organized, from the national network in different ways. The motto was and continues to be fighting violence against women. And that motto was the impetus. And then everyone did so in different ways in the country. And it continues to be done. I also wanted to note that this was also possible because there were cooperation mechanisms, sources of cooperation, who also believed in the women's movement and who also gave it impetus. And this is a major crisis right now, not only in Nicaragua, but around the world. I think that making an appeal for a form of cooperation that is belligerent, that provides resources, that makes it possible for the women's movement to continue. We're not it's not that we're going to stop because of lack of resources, but having resources, well, it definitely facilitates things. It facilitates protection, and it facilitates being able to continue bringing about actions, strategies, and policies which clearly the governments are not going to embrace on their own. That's why it's so important to issue an appeal and to take up on these results, or pick up on these results in order to help move the cooperation agencies to form partnerships with these women's organizations and movements. Finally, I would just like to thank Mary and thank all of my colleagues who have been there and continue to be there to continue to put their bodies on the line for the bodies of other women. Thank you all. Thank you, Margarita. I'll give the floor to William and we'll close out with Claudia. Yes, I wanted to mention my admiration for women who, beyond a voice, demanding for men, women, children, and the family in general, because this is not something exclusively geared to women, as many might think. It's for the family as a whole. Well, the diversity of professions and specializations that women have developed and that the different organizations have developed, women with levels of specialization in different types of therapy, in terms of legal approach, accompaniment, in developing and designing public policies. And this suggests that in order to be able to have an integral approach or comprehensive approach, you really need to have competency in all of these areas. So this is something that should be recognized. It's very important to be able to reach that level of impact on society. There also needs specialization so as to be able to cover those dimensions such that violence itself and other series of inequalities having to do with gender are expressed. It's very important to note this and to recognize, as was mentioned in the chat, the importance of bringing about changes in expressions of masculinity, which is very important. Men should be involved in these processes. That's very important because it is possible to transform, to deconstruct and reconstruct forms of masculinity so that we can all participate in this change. And thank you very much for the honor of being able to participate today. And I extend a huge embrace from a distance. And now I would give the floor to Claudia, please. Well, first I wanted to make a small comment because there were several questions about why do we think that sexual violence has not gone down in the same way as physical and emotional. But I don't have an answer. I would simply say that there are other studies that have found the same thing. And just yesterday, I was speaking with a colleague from Italy where there have been 2 surveys with 8 or 10 years separating them. And they found that some forms of sexual violence, such as undesired touching, have diminished, but rape and attempted rape, the more intense forms of sexual violence, had not changed at all in 8 years. So I think this is something that we need to reflect upon. And I relate this to what William was just saying about forms of masculinity. And this also has a lot to do with impunity. But I think we need to look more deeply into why our efforts have not had the same impact on this form of violence. I also wanted to go back to some of the points that all of you have mentioned. Once again, I would like to express thanks and reiterate that I'm very proud and pleased to be with you at this time. But I do think it's so important to have an organized movement or organized movements, as well as having strategic partnerships and how to construct those partnerships. I very much like what Violeta said, that that academia has been committed to change, committed to human rights, committed to changing gender inequality and other forms of inequality. Well, this is something that not all of academia nor all researchers show the same way these studies have shown. Making a commitment to use research and data for social change is really fundamental. And I think the other issue is the need to have a long-term view, that changes are not instantaneous, they take time. They require commitment, they require these strategic partnerships, and together with these strong social movements, there's a need for institutional change, structural change. Change in the law is obviously very important, but if the judicial system, if the legal system continues to be backward and doesn't implement the new law, then the progress is slower. So the discussions have very well illustrated all of these points. And once again, congratulations for all of those involved in the studies, the work that you've all done in Nicaragua, but also globally, and these very important contributions. And we know that you are having or experiencing a very difficult time, and this also shows just how fragile our gains are. We need to continue to celebrate them, protect them, and we also need to continue figuring out ways to, well, really to continue protecting them, because we also know that these are things that we can lose very easily. So thank you very much, and thank you for having included me in this discussion. Thank you, Claudia.
English now, just to say a few last words. First of all, thank you so much to those of you who have participated in this webinar and for all your comments. You know, COVID has been terrible in so many ways and has caused so much death and hardship and destruction. But one thing that it has allowed us to do is have a much richer and broader dialogue on these issues. You know, we're able to combine people from Europe, India, Africa, Nicaragua, and the United States at the same time. And I think that has been a really exciting experience for us. We are going to make the slides available both in English and Spanish, as well as the other resources we have. And I think if people are interested, we will also do a translation and just compile the comments, because I know lots of people, there have been so many great ideas and comments there that I'm sure people would like to be able to remember. I also wanted to say that this work on looking at social movements and how they've contributed to ending violence against women, and particularly feminist movements, as many have pointed out, is happening all over the world. And we are now planning to do a study of several countries, starting with India, South Africa, and Australia, and adding others as we find researchers who are interested in this, in a qualitative study where we compare strategies used by feminist activists in different countries. And of course, Nicaragua is the first case study, and we'll be trying to do something similar in other countries under the umbrella of the Lancet Commission to End Gender-Based Violence and Youth Maltreatment, which I'm honored to be a member of. Somebody's asking for our email address. I think we can put that out there, or send you all a message afterwards. And finally, I would just like to say what a great moment this has been for me personally. When I did my very first study on violence against women, I wasn't a researcher. I didn't know very much about research, but I had just joined the Nicaraguan Network of Women Against Violence, and we wanted to do something that would be useful to help pass the laws. And we were told that we needed hard numbers, and that I figured out, I looked it up and I found out that prevalence studies are what you call measuring with hard numbers, and learned how to do prevalence studies with my Swedish advisors and colleagues there, including Stig Wahl, and also my Nicaraguans, Andres Herrera, Rodolfo Peña, and many others that I learned from. I never dreamed that this would completely change my life. From then on, I've done really nothing but study violence against women and girls, and continue to do this. At heart, I see myself as an activist, and I find it very, I feel as though my small contribution is trying to uncover more evidence that will strengthen women's movements and strengthen the work of all of you and women's activists. And it has been such an inspiration and honor to have been able to work with all of you and those who are in the audience on this. I'll give a shout out to my father, who I noticed is who wrote in the chat, Daniel Ellsberg, who is the first person who taught me the importance of information and how powerful it is for affecting social change. So thanks, Dad, to you. And thanks to all of you for participating with us. This is just the beginning of this dialogue, and we hope to continue meeting with you and talking more and strategizing more with you. And particularly to our friends and colleagues in Nicaragua, our deepest solidarity and hopes for a better future. And we plan to continue to contribute in any way that we can. And thank you again to Maricé, Claudia, Violeta, William, and Margarita for joining us for this fantastic panel. So goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much. We can all go on mute, unmute ourselves if you want.
Thank you to everyone. Gracias.
Gracias a todos. Muy bien.
Gracias, Margarita, William.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excelente, Maricé.
Muchas gracias.
Solidaridad con
Gracias.
usted.
Emociona.
Abrazos. Gusto de verlos. Margarita, gusto de
Gracias.
verlos.
Un abrazo.
Gracias a todo el equipo del
Bye.
Global Women Institute.
And I thank the whole team from the Global Women's Institute. Devyani, Flor, and Skylar. And also thanks to Sarah and Charlie, the interpreters. Thank you.
Excelente. Sí, vamos a compilar todo.
Spotlight para Nicaragua, para las organizaciones de mujeres de
A
Nicaragua.
special focus on Nicaragua and the women's organizations in Nicaragua. Yes.
Mucha suerte.
Gracias,
Devyani,
Claudia.
can we
Hasta luego,
close the
Claudia.
webinar and then still be on, the panelists can still be here? Is that possible to do?
Skylar?
Can you close the webinar without closing everything?